Well, hello everyone. Glad you're here, as always. I know you're here for the fire and you're here for your friends. Well, that's why I'm here every week, just to see y'all and listen to some stories. Yeah, that's what we got again tonight. I want to read you a story. And I'm going to start with Chapter 25 of Dan Barry's Daughter by Max Brand. If you go back in our archive, you can listen to chapters 1 through 24. And there's also two other related stories that we read before about Dan Barry himself. Great listening. Give him a shot. This is called The Dove in the Hawk's Eyrie. So get on settled down here, folks. Let's get started. What the black, sharp eyes of MacArthur saw first as he passed through the door of the cabin was the yellow gleam of the gold which was scattered upon the table. But he did not give it a second glance. One wild evening at cards had stripped him of the gold he stole from Springer and Nichols and Gloucester. His purse was as flat as a punctured balloon, and that gold spoke to him with a welcome voice. However, he centered his attention upon the men immediately before him, and he saw at once that all was not going to pass off smoothly. They shook hands with him. There was an obvious restraint. "He's come up with a plant on the Wixon Bank," Fatty called out cheerfully, entering behind MacArthur. "I guess we're glad to see him, boys." "The Wixon Bank?" shouted Lou Cambridge and smote Cooney heavily upon the shoulder. But the other three showed no enthusiasm. Indeed, a little silence fell upon the group. "It's all worked out," said MacArthur. "I got me an inside man on the job. He's cheap and safe, and that's what we want. All I need is some men that can be depended on. Of course, I could have picked them up anywhere, but I looked back to the old days with the gang, and I figured it was worthwhile to give you all a split to show you that my heart's in the right place." The gloom of three of the men had spread to the other two. Fatty and Lou were waiting to see in what direction the wind was going to blow. Well, it was Dud Rainey who spoke, first arranging his glasses so that he could fix his mild eyes more directly upon MacArthur. "Joe," he said, "the upshot of this is that you want to be back with us?" Of course. What threw me out before was that I had trouble with Haynes. Him and me never did get on. You all know that. He always hated me. He hated me from the first minute he laid eyes on me." "He had reasons," answered Rainey. Big MacArthur flushed. "Reasons?" he echoed gloomily. "What did he say when he told you that you'd had to leave? Are you going to remember that against me, Dud?" "Haynes was a square man," said Dud. "He had a heart as big as a mountain. I remember what he said is in front of all of us. He said that you'd made trouble from the first day you came in with us. He said you was a killer, MacArthur, and he named the men you'd killed. Now, I agreed with Haynes then, and I agree with him still. I just don't think you're the sort of man to have in with us, Joe." The anger of MacArthur turned his face bright purple, but he bit his lip and then managed to smile at great cost of effort. "You know, in the old days, Haynes and you might have been right," he said, "but things, they've changed since then. In the old days, if a gent had said to me what you've just said now, I'd have had my gun out and working. But I'm a changed, Dud. Have you heard of any killings being chalked up agin my account lately?" "Yeah, you were always a smooth, quiet worker," answered Rainey. But the others seemed to have been much impressed by the speech of MacArthur. Indeed, when Dud had at first denounced the gunfighter, the others, they'd all stepped back a little as if to get away from the path of bullets which they expected to fly. When they heard MacArthur answering with words instead of his revolver, they was just plainly astonished. "Don't do your thinking too quick, Dud," remarked Lou Cambridge. "Anybody can change, can't he?" And he wagged his little head wisely upon an immense shoulders. But they don't when they develop along certain lines, replied Dud, blinking behind his glasses. You can make a pet out of a mountain lion, but let him taste a man's blood and no amount of petting will ever make him tame again. The devil's inside him to stay. And when a man finds out that there's fun in taking a chance with his own life in order to gamble at the life of another, he never changes. If he likes excitement, there ain't no excitement to equal it. Why, the rest of you ought to know. There's not a one of us that hadn't had to use his gun now and then, but we use it 'cause we have to, not because it's a game with us. MacArthur, he's different. If he smells a fight 10 miles away, he rides for it. Son, said Sliver Martin, them words sound pretty wise, but I don't know that I understand just what they mean. What's plain to me is that there's a difference here. Some of the boys want Joe back, and some don't. We'll throw a coin to decide. Is that square? Well, they all agreed that it was eminently just. And Sliver, producing a broad silver dollar from his pocket, spun it in the air as high as the roof. There it hung an instant at the top of its rise, a glittering point of light, then swooped. They did not strike the floor at once, however. With the oily ease of long practice, MacArthur slipped his weapon from its holster and fired. The dollar disappeared, clanged against the further wall, and dropped heavily. One side of it was torn away. There was a general uproar, not of anger, but of admiration. Then followed a scramble to get that coin, which Babe Cooney, by dint of tearing the others away, managed to capture as a souvenir. By God, Joe, cried Fatty Guinness, you've been a-practicing. Boys, said MacArthur, keeping back a smile of pride with an effort. This here thing means too much to me. I can't leave it to chance. I ask ye again, will you take me in? There was no doubt now. The eye of every man had kindled, and still, with a courtesy far more profound than many a circle of clubmen could have shown, they held back, suspended their own opinions, till they had heard the final voice of their companion Rainey. Perhaps Dud had been swept off his feet like the others, but his timely exhibitionist skill, or perhaps he had noted the change in the face of his friends. At any rate, he now stepped to MacArthur and offered him his hand. It was accepted at once. Joe, said Rainey, you know that I always say what I think. I said it in the first place. I suppose the rest of the boys will think that if you come back into the gang, I'd better get out if I care to keep a whole skin. But they're wrong. I've taken the privilege of changing my mind. We need men with an eye and a hand as fast as yours. Besides that, you learned when Haynes was with us, poor devil, that you couldn't bully the gang, and I don't think that you'll ever try it again. I'm with you, for one. After that, there was not a dissenting voice, and when the clamor ended, Rainey spoke up again. But there's only one way, partners, he said, that MacArthur can fit in with the scheme of things. He can't play number two. Haynes was a cleverer and bigger man than any I've ever met. Joe couldn't even play second to him. If Joe is back with us, I say that he's got to be first. He gets what Haynes got. 2 shares in every deal we push through. He gets what Haynes got. Our obedience whenever he gives an order. Now, how does that sound to you? It caused an argument, but only a brief one. There was no one who did not have to admit that they stood on precarious basis so long as every man voted on every course of action. They could not be successful without a head to direct them. No matter what faults could be found with MacArthur in other respects, they were all agreed that he had the brains for such a position. And within 10 minutes from being a candidate with dubious probability of being elected, the big fellow was installed as chief, had received the grip of every one of the other 5, and had their solemn promise to follow his orders as if he were a general and they were privates in an army. The rule of Lee Haines had been as absolute as that of a captain on a ship at sea. Now it was agreed that MacArthur should have the same powers. He lost no time in taking up his duties. At the table where the poker game had been interrupted by his arrival, he sat down and he planned for them the robbery of the Wixon Bank. With little piles of gold pieces, he checked off the positions of the houses along the main street. And with a greater pile, he indicated the bank itself. Then he told them what he had done. It was the old story. He had known of the cashier's need for money, so he had approached the man diplomatically, and in a single interview he had gained what he wanted: the combination of the safe, and the promise that the watchman should be discharged on the day of the robbery, and that a new one should not be hired in his place. And in return for this delivery of his honor, Samuel Carney had received in exchange a promise that he should have 15% of their profits. And those profits promised to be large. A full $100,000 in cash should be gained just from the safe of this bank. Now, such figures made the gang sit on up. They glanced around at one another with bright eyes and then openly complimented their new commander. Now, he proceeded on with the details. There was a stretch of 30 miles between them and the town of Wixon, but the trail was entirely, or almost entirely, downhill. That means they could cover that distance easily in 4 or 4.5 hours. Therefore, they were going to leave that camp at midnight and arrive in the heart of the little valley in the dark of the early morning, that dead time of the night when men sleep most soundly. After that, it would be a simple thing to do their work. There was not even the need of a soup to blow the safe. They had the combination and could simply talk to it and have the door to the safe wide open. There was nothing, in fact, which required more than one man for the job, except that there might be an accident, a chance passer, and in that case there might be a call for guns that would shoot straight, and several of them, for the farmers of the Wixon Valley were a fighting strain. It was at the conclusion of this talk when they first heard the singing. It came with echoes through the narrow gorge which opened into the hollow, and it was silver thin and high. Que viva la rumba, que viva placer, que viva las niñas chulitas bonitas, y guapas que saben querer. Luke Cambridge was the first to reach the door. By the great horn spoon, he cried, for he was somewhat old-fashioned in his oaths. It's a girl riding the captain, and she's coming into the holla. Chapter 26. The Might of Innocence. They poured outdoors, the 4 giants, the bespectacled student, and the pudgy Guinness. Beyond the little stream they saw that black stallion. He was neighing to one of his old companions, which was staked out in the pasture. And on the back of the captain was a girl whose wide-brimmed hat was pushed back from a face that made their hearts jump. She waved gaily to him and sang out, "Is Harry Gloucester here?" But there was no answer for a moment. In fact, not a one of them could speak until MacArthur muttered, "Let me talk to her. This Gloucester is worth somewhere between 10 and 15,000 to the gent that turns him over to the law. And if she's looking for him, you can lay to it that he's a-looking for her." And so saying, he stepped out in front of the others and approached her, sweeping off his hat. "Well, Harry's away just now," he says, but he'll be back. You climb down, you stay a while." She slipped from the saddle. She appeared younger and more frail than ever, contrasted with the black horse towering above her. He flattened his ears and snorted with anger as MacArthur drew near. Look out, he warned Joan. "That big black devil's getting ready to put his teeth in you." But at that she laughed, and to the speechless amazement of all of them, she turned and, reaching up, took the captain by the forelock and pulled down his head. And he, like some fierce Samson beguiled by a Delilah, pricked his ears and made his eyes soft with content. "You see," she said, advancing towards MacArthur again, "he really is as gentle as a lamb." Behind her came the captain, and MacArthur hastily gave ground. "Keep that black demon away from me," he pleaded. "He nearly took my head off once." She regarded him with surprise, then stripped the saddle and the bridle from him, patted his sleek neck, and waved him away to go frolic with the other horses in the pasture. Off he went, with mane shaking with his speed and the ground quivering under the impact of his hooves. He threw 3 swift circles around the enclosure to show his happiness in being home again. Then he went about to visit the other horses. Cunning, cruel as he might be to the men who strove to ride him, he was perfectly gentle with those of his own herd. "What did you do to him?" asked MacArthur, still gaping at her. "I gave him his own way," she said. "That's all there was to it." The others had drawn near by this time, and it appeared to Joan that she had never seen or heard of such men except Lee Haines. Haines, who was wise and strong enough to defy Sim Hargis and the whole town and liberate a prisoner from the jail single-handed. He was dead. But in all of these men, saving 2, she could see qualities just about as strong. There stood 4 men, shoulder to shoulder, who seemed capable of breaking through a dozen ordinary people. And as for Guinness and Dud Rainey, she changed her mind about their inefficiency as they came nearer. She was introduced to them one by one. For Guinness, in spite of his good-natured round face, had an eye as straight and cold as the eye of a bird. And about the lip of Dud Rainey there lingered a faint smile which, mild as his features were, gave a hint of quiet, limitless cruelty. Yet there was not one of the 6 who was not strong enough to be worthy of Lee Haines, and perhaps it was their sheer strength which had attracted Harry Gloucester to them. They asked her how she had known that Gloucester was one of them. If he himself had told her, then he would have met her there, but she answered that she had simply deducted his membership in the gang from the fact that Haines had given his life to save him. It was Fatty Guinness who suggested that she might be hungry. In an instant, they were all busy. Some were cutting wood. Some were preparing food. All the old cabin was filled with a bustle, half of which was the frantic effort to make that big room seem more presentable when MacArthur should bring the girl there. In the meantime, fragments of the conversation between the chief and Joan were repeated, and the work of slicing bacon or brewing coffee or sweeping out with a heavy pine bow or kicking soiled clothes and tattered garments into an obscure corner. All that ceased while the report was listened to, which the last man to bring in wood or water had heard as he went past the couple. "MacArthur's gone," was the first bulletin. "He's sitting there with a full smile on his face. He looks like a 6-year-old born without a brain, and he can't keep his eyes off on that girl." How long can you be staying here to wait for Harry?" said Joe. "Till sometimes this afternoon?" Or longer than that," says she. "I'm in no hurry. It's so beautiful up here. I could stay a month and be happy." Joe looks as if she'd tapped him between the eyes with a monkey wrench. "A month?" he croaks. "Ain't your folks going to miss you a little bit before that time comes along?" "My father and my mother are dead," she said. "There's only one Buck Daniels to miss me, and then, you know, I had to leave him sometime, and why shouldn't it be now?" It was Lou Cambridge who repeated this choice bit of talk, which he had overheard to and from the pond to carry water, straining to catch the syllables, ears which had been nicely trained in the greatest of all schools for hearing, burglary. His report was greeted with a murmur of the profoundest interest. "You heard that, boys?" asked Big Babe Cooney, his warrior face growing pale with emotion. "You heard that talk? She ain't had a mother and a father to look after her. She don't know nothing about the dangers of the world. And now, damn my soul, if she don't come up here and ride in among us like a bird flying in out of a storm. But no harm ain't going to come to her. No harm ain't going to come to her." He repeated that solemn warning and rolled his terrible eyes around the room from face to face. But he found that all the others were equally busy scowling at one another as if to find some shadow of guilt revealed. All saving Dud Rainey, who was merely blinking behind his glasses, as usual, and rubbing the tips of his fingers carefully over his chin. 4 suspicious glances centered sharply upon him. But with a sigh he resumed his work of sweeping again, unhurried, dreamy, Now it was Sliver Martin who brought the next tidings. He staggered through the door with his face so lengthened that his cheeks seemed to be flattened together. He let his armful of wood crash upon the floor. "My God, boys," he groaned, "listen to what I heard." "Well, you and Gloucester have been engaged quite a while," he asks. "Engaged," says she. "Oh, no." "But ain't you come up here to see Harry?" "Well, yeah, why wouldn't I," says she. "I tell you, boys, that skunk Gloucester's been deceiving her. Besides, what gent with half a heart would keep right on making love to a girl like that when he was outlawed and a price put on his head? A gent that would murder two stiff-armed old sourdoughs would do that same thing," remarked Fatty Guinness. "Why, damn a low hound like him. But you heard the chief's plan, and I say it's a mighty good one. We keep that girl here for bait long enough to draw in Gloucester, then tap him on the head, unbeknownst to her, and go down, one of us that ain't known in the town, and collect that reward. Now that's good business. The very best thing that can happen to that girl is to have Gloucester wiped up dry." "You think she loves him?" asked that mild voice of Dud Rainey. "Listen to old Four Eyes," sneered Lou Cambridge, who had a natural antipathy for the quiet voice and the careful diction of that little man. "Look at the old owl that sees everything by night and can't see nothing when the sun is shining on it for him. Why did she come up here if she ain't in love with him? You talk ridiculouser than hell, Dud." "You've learned a number of new words, I see," said Dud Rainey, and smiled upon him deliberately, showing him every one of his white teeth. And just as suddenly Lou Cambridge caught his breath and changed color. It was plainly to be seen that he knew he must resent this affront if he wished to keep his head high in the gang, and yet it was equally plain that he knew he would deal him with dynamite if he crossed that smaller man. But Fatty Guinness averted a crisis by stepping suddenly between the two. "What do you all mean by this fool talk?" he inquired. "Are you going to spoil our party by starting a whole flock of shooting? If you scare her away, you'll have MacArthur himself in here with the 2 guns ready to work." "I said that anybody could see that she was in love," remarked Luke Cambridge, leaving out his former emphasis. There was a general murmur of assent, but Rainey answered, "Perhaps she does, I don't know. But for my part, I don't think she could love a man. She has a long-distance look in her eye." "What the devil are you driving at now?" asked Babe Cooney. "Nothing," murmured Dud Rainey, and went on with his work. Yet he had said enough to make 'em all watch her like hawks when at length she was called in for dinner. It was noted that Joe MacArthur did not sit down with her to the table, although as chief of the band he had the right to assume the place of host. Instead, he wandered out of the house into the open, wearing an expression half strained and half gloomy, as if he had been brought in eye contact with something which he needed time to think over. But though they saw this to begin with, and they noticed Dud Rainey standing apart and studying the girl's face with his peculiar cold smile as if he were striving to remember it for a draw-on, the 4 others could see no reason to think Joan other than a very young, very innocent, and strangely charming girl. She made herself as perfectly at home as if they were just all old friends sitting at the table in her own ranch. She chatted away busily, and they watched her slim brown hands and the changing shimmer of light in her hair and the blue of her eyes with a hushed fascination. She told them how she had won the black stallion, and then how he had brought her through the mountains, picking his own way, while she sat the saddle and let him go where he would. She told them how he had watched her fish, and how he had stood over her and observed the process of building a fire and cooking with a scrupulous interest, as if it were something which he wished to learn for his own sake. She told all this, moreover, with such enthusiasm, with such graceful and eager little gestures, that they laughed when she laughed, smiled when she smiled. They were so wrapped in her words that they quite forgot about serving her. They left it to Dud Rainey quietly to refill her tin cup and with coffee and place more crispy slices of bacon on her plate. Certainly, there was nothing peculiar about her except that she was more lovely, more naive than any girl they had ever dreamed of, far less even seen. And then, in the very midst of a sentence, she stopped speaking, straightened just a little, and stared far off before her. They glanced hastily around at the doorway, but it was empty. "What is it?" asked Babe Cooney, his rough voice reduced to a whisper. "Hush! Don't you hear?" she asked them. They heard it then for the first time. The faint dissonance of wild geese crying out the heart of the sky. They heard it, and they looked back to the girl, and now they saw the shadow of a smile beginning on her lips, but never growing. A smile which was neither sad nor happy. But suddenly, every man looked thoughtfully down, and into their minds rushed the same picture of a wedge of the wild geese streaming north and north to a land of blue lakes and shadowy virgin forests and mountains from whose heads the snow never melted. This is chapter 27, An Unexpected Mercy. President Oscar Fern of the Wixon Bank was one of those persons who are envied not for their brains, but for their luck. He controlled the banking business of this rich little irrigation district, not because men believed in his business intelligence, but because there was a vast confidence in his good luck. If luck served Oscar Fern well, it must necessarily serve his depositors well also. When his career was mentioned, it was always recounted how he just happened to have bought one of the largest of the old cattle ranches in the valley just before water was brought in. And again, he just happened to have good fortune and hang on to his lands after the first water boom had failed and men were selling out, right and left, because of the terrible pressure of the water taxes. Oscar, he did not sell, not because he saw through the present difficulty into a radiant future, but because he had not the energy to split up his big property and get rid of it in small parcels. So he survived the blue days, and he became wealthy. When he established his bank, there was no competitor. And as a matter of fact, people have a greater respect for luck than they have for intelligence. They respected not Oscar himself, but the quality which had fallen from heaven upon him. And as Samuel Carney, the lean and gray-headed terrier-like man who was cashier of the bank, walked down the street this morning, nearly every man who passed him said, "Well, there goes the brains of the Wixon Bank. Fern is a mighty lucky fellow to have such a man for mere wages. One of these days, Carney will be made partner, and then watch his dust. He's got the genius." Now, such was the atmosphere of adulation through which Samuel Carney walked. It had lightened his step on many a day back and forth from the grind of the work at the bank, but today it did not help him. The morning was very hot, although the spring was not yet old and the hour was early. But here was a little foretaste of the blast of the summer sun, and the sidewalk burned Carney's feet through the thin soles of his shoes. He hurried on to get out of the heat, and yet as he found that he was coming so rapidly to the bank, he slowed his pace again. The bank had suddenly become like a plague house to him. At that building he had built his reputation. In that bank he'd established himself as a man of spotless integrity, sound mind, and scrupulously honest business methods. It had been the great jewel of his life, this repute for honesty and honor. His neighbors had brought to him their little fine points of behavior. He splits the straws for them and showed them the right path. He was surrounded, in the eyes of the good people of the town of Wixon, with all the solemn atmosphere of a judge. This was the thing which had been enshrined in the bank. Now he was to throw the idol away. He was to deceive his very employer, share in the loot that a band of ruffians secured, and afterwards he must continue in his place, wear a solemn face about the crime, and in a year or more, perhaps, gravely accept the place of a partner in the firm from which he had stolen. As he thought of all this, he grew cold at heart in spite of the heat of the day, and he went on with his fighting jaw thrusting out. And, like a cunning man, he began to prove to himself that he had made a bargain worthwhile, after all, by estimating for the 100th time the gains as contrasted with the losses. To begin with, there was the vital need which he had to meet. There was the musical training for which Claire had eaten out her heart in yearning, and yet in silence, since her very childhood. There was the privilege of sending his wife to New York for the best medical treatments which might, even now, save her. Yeah, $15,000 would easily do all these things. The $15,000 being spent away from the hometown would waken no suspicions. Moreover, who could ever connect him with such a crime? It could not be. His position in the town of Wixon was a brazen tower of strength. No eye would ever dream of looking towards him, and therefore no eye would ever see him. He saw, then, as a result of his connivance at the theft, a solid financial gain, which would be an infinitesimal boon to his family and which would in no wise endanger his position. But could the taking of $100,000 from the bank really be looked upon as a barren theft? Nah, he felt that it was not. In the long course of his connection with the bank, he had surely given them 100-fold more than the salary which had been paid to him. He could point back, during the last 3 years alone, to definite places where his advice had been sought for and accepted, and out of which the bank had actually gained more in solid cash than the $100,000 of which he now proposed to deprive it. Fortified with these thoughts, he advanced more easily toward the bank and opened the door, whistling softly, as was his custom, through his teeth. He almost ran into the president himself as he stepped inside, and he gasped out loud with a touch of horror. The swelling form and the rosy, smiling face of Oscar Fern might have been a nightmare. This was a whole hour earlier than the time at which the president generally appeared. What could have brought him here this day of all days? A fire of shame and terror penetrated to the heart of the cashier. "What's wrong, Sammy?" asked Fern. "You look like the devil, all shot for a fact. No sleep?" "No sleep," muttered Carney, his eyes on the floor. And although he fought to look up, he could not. "This damn touch of hot weather was what did it," Fern declared. "Kind of bothered me myself." And he laughed apologetically, as if there was something ridiculous in the thought that anything could really trouble him in his sleep. Carney glanced up curiously. No, nothing could bother Oscar Fern. No qualms of conscience, at least, would ever stab his brain in the middle of the night and make him stare into the dark with a weakly fluttering heart and a sense of mortal shame and fear. He tried to rouse his own anger. This man should have doubled his salary 3 years ago and should have doubled it again. "What you need to do is take a day off," Fern suggested. "Damn if you don't look hard hit." A day off?" said Carney, seizing easily on grounds which could serve as a basis to work himself into an anger. "A day off? Where the devil would things be?" The president caught his breath, frowned, then looked somewhat agape over the head of his cashier. "Doggone if you ain't right, Sammy," he murmured. "Matter of fact, you never do take a day off, do you?" "If a vacation came up and stared me in the face," said Carney, "I wouldn't know what to call it." "That's so. I was talking to Green on the phone. He says it's true. The F, L, and M is going to build a branch line into the valley." Carney listened with half his mind. It was well enough to turn the subject, but he brooded savagely on his injuries as he went on into his room. They had brought it on themselves, he vowed, and then he flung himself into his work with a savage energy. But in spite of himself, he found himself coming to a pause every now and then, his eyes possessed with a hazy vision of his wife, Agnes, meeting him at the door some night with a white face and saying, "I know it all. I know it all, oh, Sammy, dear. We won't talk about it. I don't accuse you. I know it's for Claire's sake and mine, but, oh, God, Sammy, we've thrown away our honor and we can never get it back again. We've thrown away our honor and nothing in the world can ever bring it back." Always he came out of this dream to hear his assistant murmuring beside him, "I say, Mr. Carney, if you'll excuse me for interrupting you, I want to bring this little matter to your attention and, When noon came, he did not eat. Instead, he took a walk through the fierce sun. He filled his lungs to the bottom with air. Then he came back and he went at his work again. The heavy footfall of the fat president entered the bank an hour and a half later. Oscar Fern kept Paris hours as far as the noonday meal was concerned, and Carney ground his teeth. "You fat-faced fool," he snarled to himself. "You have the front, but who does the work? Who has the brains? Who's holding you up? I do it. I do it." Here there was a murmur from the little muffled bell in his room. It was a summons from the president, and he went in slowly, gathering up on the way 2 letters about which he must consult Fern. What jokes these consultations were. For 5 years he had never been crossed. He found Fern tilted back in his chair with his thumbs hooked into the armholes of his vest, his rubber heels on the top of his desk, and a fat cigar in his mouth. He was frowning at the ceiling and rolling the cigar from one side to the other, chomping on it nervously. He paid no attention to Carney as the latter entered. "Here's another letter from Dundee about the terms," began Carney. "Damn Dundee," said Oscar Fern. "I want to talk to you, Sammy." "You heard a good yarn?" asked the cashier with secret contempt. "How much money have you saved?" God, it was a bolt from the blue. Perspiration stood out on Carney's upper lip. He wiped it away with the tips of his fingers. "Why, a few thousand." How's Agnes?" blurted out the president. It made Carney start, almost rise from his chair. "Well, she's the same." "Well, you ought to get her out of town." Silence. "Carney, you've got to get her out of town. I saw her while I was heading home for lunch. She smiled at me from your door. She looked just like the very devil, Carney. Her face has been haunting me." "And me," groaned Carney. "Ah, lad," murmured Oscar Fern, and laid his fat hand on the shoulder of his cashier. "And never a word from you about her. That's what's been eating your heart out. But no talk, no complaining. Sammy, there's going to be a change. A great big change. In the first place, you get a bonus of $5,000 in hard cash payable in 10 minutes to yourself. And in the second place, you get a raise. You could use another $1,500 a year. My girl tells me that your Claire has always wanted to go away to study music. I don't know why. It seems to me that she's the real pretty on the piano the way it is, but if she's got her heart set on it, why, she ought to go, and go she shall, Sammy. There's another thing. When I seen you this morning looking so damn thin and black around the eyes, it hurts me. Sammy, my God, am I a slave driver? Are my dollars just drops of blood? No, sir. I'd throw the damn money into the river first. I'd give it back to the place it came from. And one of the places is from you. Sammy, you pack up tonight and you hop a train tomorrow. You're going to take Agnes to New York. You're going to get her cured, and you're going to take in the sights for yourself. Wait, gasped Carney. Well? Oscar, his face had convulsed. A shuddering weakness entered him. He hid his face with his gnarled fingers, and the sobs swelled up in him. He fought them back, and they choked him. Good God, whispered Oscar Fern. He stole tiptoe to the door. He locked it. And as if this were not security enough, he put his thick shoulder again it and, turning, stared at his cashier, sweating. Was this Bulldog Carney? Was this the man of iron? He went back and he put his arms around the thin, labor-stooped shoulders. Sammy, he whispered. Don't do it, Sammy. It makes me sick. It makes a fool out of me. Don't do it, Sammy. Tears began to run down his fat, rosy face. I ain't through, old friend, he gasped. I never thought of it before. I never thought about what you might be needing. But just ask me what you want. I don't care what. I'll give it. The whole damn bank ain't worth a thing like this. A choked, groaning voice from Samuel Carney answered. I'm a dog, Oscar. I'm a low hound. I'm worse than that. I'm lower than a snake. You? You? Listen to me. I got to tell you, Oscar. I'll tell you the truth, then get out. And tell the truth he did. Haltingly, without excuses. The whole terrible tale of how MacArthur had approached him, of how he had been talked into a plot, of how he had been given the combination of the safe, of the $15,000 he was to get. He told it with all his face still in his hands, his head bowed low, and after he had ended, for some time he heard the thick, hurried panting of Oscar Fern. Then that familiar fat hand reached out and took the screen away from his face. "Dear old Sammy," he heard Oscar say. He looked up, mortally ashamed of his tears, but he was comforted by the gray face and the trembling lips of Oscar. And there was something so childish in the fat man's staring round eyes of horror and grief that he almost wanted to laugh. Man, gasped Oscar Fern. "I don't know how you could have been tempted like that and not fallen. Thank God you were strong enough to tell me, out of your own free will." "Don't say that," groaned Carney. "You forced out of me with that great big kind heart of yours and hush up. Shut up. Damn it. Why, Sammy, I feel like this here thing has made us brothers. That skunk, that snake MacArthur, we'll be ready when he comes. Not that, Oscar. I'd be murderer if I let him walk into a trap. When was this to happen? Tonight. Then warn him off. Can you send a messenger? Yeah. Well, do that. But just in case that messenger doesn't reach him in time, we'll be ready, Sammy. I'll have guns enough ready to blow them to bits." Okay, folks. That's an interesting double cross. Yeah. Interesting. And there's more to this story next time we get around this campfire. You know how that goes. Well, folks, you know what's going to make me feel good right now? It's one of them cowboy caramels. You can buy them on our buy site right here in the store. I'm going to go get me one. So, I'll say it right now. I'll see you all again next week. Adios. It was Clay Steele.